little bit vertically challenged here, so here we go. Tonight I chose to speak on something that doesn't get covered very often, and I shared with my student assistant the other day that I would like to speak and title my remarks tonight, Reclaiming the Tragedy of Resurrection. He got this horrified look on his face, and he said, "Brother Wayment, everyone will walk out." I'm speaking of the triumph and tragedy of resurrection, but privately I'm speaking about the tragedy. Resurrection was a tragedy before it was a triumph. J.R.R. Tolkien coined the word a eucatastrophe to describe a very specific moment in a story. He said, quote, "I coined the word eucatastrophe, the sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with joy, that brings tears, which I argued is the highest function of fairy stories to produce. And I was led there to the view that it produces its peculiar effect because it is a sudden glimpse of the truth, your whole nature chained in material cause and effect. The chain of death feels a sudden relief, as if a major limb out of joint had suddenly snapped back. I would assert this evening that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is on one level a catastrophe, perhaps even a eucatastrophe, that has been often overlooked due to the fact that its clearly positive outcomes and historical event have become intimately intertwined with its positive consequences and results. I think the reason for the overshadowing of the catastrophe of the resurrection is captured well in the words of the 19th century philosopher Paul Ricoeur. He said, quote, "If the resurrection is a resurrection from the dead, all hope and freedom are in spite of death. In other words, a life in the hope of resurrection is possible only because resurrection has removed the sting of death. Or as Paul said, 'Where is thy sting, O grave? Where is thy victory?' 1 Corinthians 15. Resurrection has a way of dominating the autonomy of our concerns for our own lives, for our own well-being, but in dominating them, it also gives them direction, purpose, and even hope. A person's sufferings, for example, which are far more immediate and visible, may be reinterpreted and resignified based on an anticipation of the resurrection. But a resurrection-centered Christian existence is a modern experience, one that took time to develop and germinate sufficiently so that it could yield the fruit of hope. I want to speak about the catastrophe before allowing hope in the resurrection to dominate my remarks. And in doing so, I think we may tonight recover a different kind of hope, or a different vantage point on hope. I also want to move this discussion away from the historical and to ask the question of why a Christian believer would write about the fear they felt so many years after the event of the resurrection transpired. In the accounts left to us by Jesus' early disciples concerning the morning of the resurrection and the few days that followed it, each of the four evangelists described the primary emotion felt by those who went to the tomb and saw Jesus as fear. The accounts are punctuated by doubt, fear, and uncertainty. And as I prepped for tonight, I went back, looked at the Greek, the English translations. They do not talk about the resurrection in terms of joy and celebration. There is no triumph. I'm sharing here with you on the screen that I'll move quickly through these resurrection accounts just to draw out the notion of fear. Quote, "And the angel answered and said unto the women, Fear ye not, for I know that you seek Jesus which was crucified. And quote, and they departed quickly from the sepulchre with fear and great joy. Then said Jesus unto them, Be not afraid. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted." From the Gospel of Mark, he said unto them, quote, "Be not affrighted." And they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre, for they trembled and were amazed. And she went and told them that he had been with them, as they mourned and wept. From the Gospel of Luke, who has more information about it than any other evangelist, comes the following. "And it came to pass, as they were much perplexed thereabout, and as they were afraid, they bowed their faces to the earth. And their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not. But we trusted that it had been he which should have redeemed Israel. Yea, and certain women also of our company made us astonished. And they said one to another, Did not our heart burn within us?" I should add that burning is a negative concept in the New Testament, except once in Luke 12:35, where it refers to a burning lamp. it's usually a force of destruction or lust. Jesus himself stood in the midst of them and said, "Peace, peace be unto you." But they were terrified and affrighted. And he said unto them, "Why are you troubled?" And while they yet believed not for joy and wondered. From the Gospel of John, quote, "But Mary stood without the sepulchre weeping. Then the same day at evening, before the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled, for," quote, "fear of the Jews. Then said he to Thomas, Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it in my side, and be not faithless." The resurrection was traumatic for them. I found 2 quotes that restore hope, and hopefully make you feel a little bit better for a moment. The final 2 verses of the Gospel of Luke record, "And they worshipped him, and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and were continually in the temple." And this one from the Gospel of John, "Then were the disciples glad when they saw the Lord." Those 2 references stand in opposition to over 20 that document their fear. I would like to propose 3 reasons why fear is the dominant emotion of the first resurrection accounts. First, an expression of fear may be a feature of respect and reverence meant to show that the earliest disciples approached the resurrected Lord with appropriate devotion. The transition from mortal Lord to resurrected and deified Lord was a difficult one that needed time to be fully understood. They had dined with the mortal Jesus, they had walked with him, but the transition to worshiping him directly was made obvious through the resurrection. However, it must have taken time for them to become accustomed to doing so. Also, fear has negative connotations in modern religious vocabulary, but is it a positive emotion in the Bible? For example, Job 28:28 reports, quote, "Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding." Or in the words of Paul, quote, "Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling," end of quote, Philippians 2:12. In the biblical world, religious devotion was expressed in terms of fear, trembling, gratitude, and reverence. A person's fear of the Lord was a statement of orientation towards God, and there were perhaps no better way to express a proper level of devotion than through a statement of fear. The disciples were not afraid of Jesus, but they were afraid of the resurrected Lord. A shift in their relationship had taken place, and they wanted to express that fundamental shift in the ways that they retold the stories of the resurrection. Although this sense of fear was not directly a tragedy, it signified a radical and perhaps even soul-rending departure of an old relationship to a new one. I certainly believe that the disciples were respectful of Jesus while he lived with them, but the resurrection had to have changed the ways they thought of him. It must have caused them to reinterpret previous conversations, interactions, and sayings. A resurrected mortal must have been both alarming and comforting, and the resurrected Lord could certainly never return to being mortal again. They certainly could never wear the same clothing again, dine in the same places, and like they needed to find a new wardrobe or new places to dine, it required new relationships. You and I might tell the story using the language of reverence and worship, but I would contend that the most respectful way that a person could tell that story was using the verb of fear. I would also go as far as suggesting that by writing that they feared the Lord in his resurrection, the evangelists were acknowledging their acceptance of Jesus Christ as their Lord and God. My second point tonight. I wish to make the point tonight this evening is that the death of Jesus ended friendships and relationships that were not restored through resurrection. Christians had no sense of a triumphal Jesus returning in second coming glory to remedy their sense of tragedy. So much of how we understand Jesus in the resurrection is derived from sources that early Christians simply did not have: the New Testament, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, or the Pearl of Great Price. The few teachings on the subject of the resurrection from the Old Testament carry mixed meaning. I've excerpted all of them here. That sounds daunting. It'll take us a minute to get through them. Daniel 12:2, "And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. From Job, a poem. Remember that my life is wind, mine eyes shall no more see good. The eye of him that hath seen me shall no more see no more. Thine eyes are upon me, and I am not. As the cloud is consumed and vanisheth away, so he that goeth down to the grave shall come up no more. He shall return no more to his house, neither shall his place know him any more. From Isaiah 26, thy dead men shall live, together with my body shall they arise. Awake and sing, ye that dwell in dust. For thy dew is as the dew of the herbs, and the earth shall cast out the dead. And this last passage from Job again, the one that gets quoted most oft. For I know that my Redeemer liveth, that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not another, though my reins shall be consumed within me. And by the way, the word reins is kidneys. The LDS King James Version of the Bible is 1,184 pages long, and those 9 verses represent the sum total of all resurrection teachings from the Old Testament. The New Testament contains clear teachings about the resurrection, but even it indicates that some people anticipate that only the righteous would be resurrected. I quote Luke 20, verse 35 in this regard. But they which shall be accounted worthy to obtain that world and the resurrection from the dead, neither marry nor are giving in marriage. Hardly a resounding endorsement of resurrection. Or from Philippians 3:11, if by any means I might attain the resurrection from the dead, which Paul says near the end of his life. Nothing in the life of Jesus fully prepared his followers for the radical departure that was necessitated by the crucifixion. In the days following Jesus' death, when his followers were dealing with the feelings of rage and injustice, coping with the meaning of betrayal, and trying to understand how a disciple like Peter could deny the Lord on the night of his death, Jesus presented himself alive. The resurrection may have been a triumph in salvation, but it provided no clarity of meaning for the events that had just transpired. Peter was still Peter, Judas had gone away, and the disciples' lives were still in danger. But perhaps most tragically, mortal relationships were changed forever. Anyone who has experienced the loss of a loved one appreciates the sense that death is not a solution, but a powerful moment of reflection and change. I think that Nelson Mandela captured what I am trying to say well. He said, quote, from his book in 1994, Long Walk to Freedom, I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers fear. Pain had to give way to courage, and the fear of seeing Jesus in new ways had to eventually develop into productive ways of changing that feeling of fear to becoming something new. Peter's voice attests to this sense of loss and new beginning. From his epistle, 1 Peter 1:3, quote, by his great mercy he has given us a new birth into a living hope in the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. What remains unstated is that Peter lost a friend in the crucifixion and gained a Lord in the resurrection. My final point 3. The triumph of the resurrection was Jesus' triumph, first and foremost, and over time it became the triumph of all Christians. As stated earlier, some early believers felt that only the righteous or only a select few could be resurrected. As Luke recorded, there is a reward granted to the righteous in the resurrection of the just. Luke 14:14. John recorded a similar idea. And shall come forth they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. The idea that there was a, quote, resurrection of life or a resurrection of just is not a terribly comforting idea to an average believer who does not know what will become of the mediocre and less than perfect. It's all good and well to speak of a resurrection of the just, but few followers ever feel justified unless just is defined as just like everyone else. I don't believe that early Christians were pessimists, but when presented with the feelings of loss and the mortal passions that they felt, a promise of a future existence with the just has sway only for the justified. For others, it's terrifying, daunting, too distant and vague. I can't imagine the feelings of a man who denied who sees the person alive whom he denied. And he calls him my disciple. My sense from reading their accounts that they passed on to us is that it took a time for the tragedy to become a reality, and then for that reality to be interpreted as triumph like you and I do. Paul's letters to the Romans shows the early stages of hope beginning to develop in his heart. Quote Romans 6:5. For if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall be also in the likeness of his resurrection. It took Paul contemplating his own death to see that resurrection might be triumph. Later, to Timothy, Paul, or one of his later biographers, wrote these words, For God hath not given us to the spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and a sound mind. A more powerful statement that shows the beginning of the believer making sense of the tragedy occurs in the opening lines to Romans. Quote, and was declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness by resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. That statement captures the tensions that I have been attempting to draw your attention to this evening. The resurrection proved that Jesus was the Son of God, but it did not change the historical situation of the disciples or those who followed Jesus. None of us will ever walk with mortal Jesus. Those days are no longer recoverable, and the Jesus of history was put to death, and then he was resurrected 3 days later as the exalted Christ. My concluding remarks. I would like to offer a few thoughts that hopefully can bring some positive back and won't leave you feeling dire this evening. I want to capture the idea of belief now. I continue to believe in my own personal way that the Jesus of history continues to be important, and therefore the resurrection is a valuable moment for me because it represents the end of history and the beginning of something else, tangible for some, but not for me, knowable, but through different senses. One of the challenging features of post-first century Christianity is that the Jesus who lived is different from the Jesus who is the Jesus shaped by the one who lives today. I often encounter descriptions of the Jesus of history that are so infused by the resurrected Jesus that the historical Jesus fades and becomes indiscernible. As a historian of first century Christianity, I'm intrigued by this process because I would argue that the Jesus who lived in Galilee and taught in Judea was not fully cognizant of what the resurrected Christ would be. He, like us, anticipated salvation or exaltation. He lived a perfect life, but did he fully know who and what he would become? And as Tony so well talked tonight, Doctrine and Covenants 93 leads us to believe he learned it. I believe his life was animated by hope and knowledge, not frequently like yours and mine. His hope and knowledge may have been fuller and more vivid. I can understand the fear felt by the earliest followers of Jesus when they experienced the tragedy of his death and the reality of an empty tomb. Christianity's empty tomb is perhaps the world's most compelling religious image. Full stop. I too would have been afraid, and as I watch the transition from fear to hope, I find meaning. I gain something. I think the creative energy that followed the resurrection, the energy that compelled Jesus' followers to find meaning in tragedy, is not unlike a modern experience. We look to seek solace when a loved one departs from us. We may feel that they were needed for another position, or we may feel that our limited perspective cannot grasp God's plan. I often hear people say he was called home as we seek to understand a tragic death. If the New Testament teaches us anything, it is that it is okay to feel afraid, to feel hurt by the loss, and to find creative ways to make sense of our new changed reality going forward. I think that is where hope comes in. I would share with you my hope in that resurrection. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.